I've never been one to write on forums, but today something tightened my chest in a different way. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's the memory of what I was, what I am. Or maybe it's because I need someone to read this. Someone who won't simply call me foolish or weak. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. My name is Jorge. I'm 68 years old, and until a few years ago, I believed I was living for something bigger than myself. That the love I gave would return somehow, even if not now. I've always been the kind of man who said yes. Yes to everything that involved my daughter. From her first cry, I knew my world had changed forever. Elisa was born on a summer afternoon in 1987. Her mother, Anna, was tired, sweaty, but smiling. I held that wrinkled little thing, her eyes still bleary, and felt like the whole world fit in that hospital room. I made a silent promise as I cradled her in my arms. Everything I have will be yours. I will be your safe haven. Always. Anna died when Elisa was just 5 years old. An aggressive cancer that didn't even give us time to plan our mourning. The pain was so great that for a few days I forgot how to breathe. But Elisa was there with fearful eyes, wanting to understand where her mother was. And I had to get up, even with my heart torn open. I promised myself that for her, I would be too. Mother and father. Love and discipline. Comfort and protection. Elisa's childhood was simple but full of affection. I worked as a maintenance technician at a public school and did odd jobs at night. There was never much left over, but she never went to bed hungry, never felt cold. Every time she wanted something, a doll, a walk, a book, I found a way. I sold a tool, cut back on my expenses, skipped buying a new shirt. But she had it. And seeing that girlish smile was the fuel of my life. When she reached adolescence, things got a little more difficult. Elisa started to withdraw. First, she stopped talking to me as much. Then she started complaining about the clothes, the small house, the simple way we lived. She said her classmates had everything of the finest quality, and that she felt like an outsider in their world. I tried to talk, to explain that life was more than appearances, that character mattered. But she just rolled her eyes. Still, I kept saying yes. She wanted to go on an exchange program during high school. I sold my car, the only one I ever owned, and paid half the price, the rest with a loan that took me years to pay off. When she returned, she was different. More distant, colder, but I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass, that she just needed time. A father's love doesn't demand immediate reciprocity, I thought. College arrived. An expensive course at a private university in another city. Once again, I sold what I could, took out another loan, and squeezed out everything I could. The house we lived in needed renovation. The roof was always leaking when it rained, but that was okay, as long as she was comfortable and didn't feel inferior to others. She graduated, and I confess I cried with pride. Alone, in the corner of the auditorium, I clapped until my hands burned. She didn't see me there. She was busy with her friends with her new boyfriend, but that was okay. I was where I always wanted to be, cheering her on even if silently. The engagement happened suddenly. A dinner, a simple ring, and a hasty decision. I tried to talk to her, suggesting that maybe it was too soon, but she interrupted me. "Dad, don't start. You've never said no to me, remember? So just support me, okay?" And I supported her. Of course I did. The wedding was another milestone. Big, expensive, over the top. I sold my house to pay for most of it. Literally. The house where I lived for 20 years, where Anna and I created memories, where I saw my daughter take her first steps. I sold everything. At her request, part of the proceeds went toward a down payment on a new house. A beautiful, modern, spacious country residence with a garden and gourmet area. I gave the rest to her and her husband. Make your own lives. Be happy. She cried, hugged me, and said, "Dad, you're the best in the world." That was the last time I heard that. After the wedding, I moved into a small rented apartment in the old part of town. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a living room kitchen barely big enough for a table. I felt empty, but I consoled myself with the thought that my daughter now had everything, that I had fulfilled my role. The first year passed slowly. Few calls, almost no visits. When I called, she'd say she was busy, that work was demanding. I understood. After all, young people have their own lives, their own routines. Who am I to get in the way? But my health began to show signs. A constant cough, fatigue, dizziness. Nothing serious, according to the doctor, but he said I needed care. Rest. Someone nearby. So I thought about asking for something simple. A room. Just 1 room in that large house I'd helped buy. I called her. I told her how I was doing, explained the situation. She was silent for a few seconds, and then she chuckled. Dad, the house is full, but there's room in the basement if you want. That stopped me. I laughed along, unsure of what to say. I said I'd think about it, that it wasn't urgent. I hung up and stared at the ceiling of my rented room, where the paint was peeling and the light bulb flickered. The basement, the space where junk is stored, where no one lives, where what one doesn't want to show is hidden. That night I cried for the first time in a long time. I haven't told you everything yet. There's more. But I needed to start here. Maybe to remind myself that I exist. That, as much as I said yes to love, maybe now I need to say yes to myself. If anyone read this far, thank you. Really. Sometimes we just want to be heard. The wedding took place in a glass-enclosed hall high above the city, overlooking the mountains and a sunset that seemed to have been commissioned just for that day. While everyone toasted to Elisa and Marcos's future, I stood in the back, observing every detail with my heart racing, because I knew that every light, every flower in the center of the table, every carefully chosen porcelain plate had been paid for with what was left of my life as a simple man, with the papers from the sale of my house still warm in my briefcase. And yet, even feeling the weight of the decisions I had made for love, I smiled, because when you're a father and you only have one daughter, you don't measure the consequences. You just give. During the ceremony, I remember searching her eyes, trying to find in them a trace of the girl who clung to my neck in fear of thunder. But I found only a grown woman, beautiful, yes, self-assured, but strangely distant, as if she were already far beyond the place where I stood, and while everyone applauded the vows, I silently accepted that my role had perhaps ended there, at that altar where she passed, symbolically, into the arms of another man, and where I, unintentionally, left a piece of my existence behind. The first year after that wedding was the loneliest of my life, although no one around me knew it, because I learned from an early age that silence is the shelter of those who suffer with dignity. And I never wanted to burden anyone with my laments, so I endured the calls that were no longer returned, the forgotten birthdays, the anniversaries where a quick text message replaced a hug, and I accepted, with a bitter mixture of understanding and sadness, that my daughter now lived another life, a life in which I seemed to have become nothing more than a distant memory, or worse, a burden. In the small apartment I rented in the city center, surrounded by old buildings and cracked sidewalks, the days dragged by between the noise of traffic and the silence within the walls, and each object I brought into that space, the chair Anna loved, the photo frame with the picture of Elisa as a child, the old radio that still worked, seemed to carry not only memories, but also the echo of what I had lost along the way. As if with each box I opened, I unearthed a piece of myself that I no longer knew how to fit into this new phase of life, where neighbors greeted me with a distant wave, unaware of the story that hid behind my tired gaze. My health began to fail quietly, like someone asking for permission before collapsing, first with a persistent cough, then with dizziness that forced me to sit down in the middle of the street one time, embarrassed like a lost child. And although the doctor said it was just a virus, that it was normal for my age, I felt there was something deeper eating away at me, maybe not in my body, but in my soul, that constant feeling of exhaustion, as if I had used up all my emotional reserves and was now living on credit, feigning normality so as not to worry anyone, especially her, Elisa, because I still had the instinct to protect her, even though she no longer cared. It was then, on a rainy, feverish night, that I decided to call her, and I remember to this day the words I carefully chose, trying not to sound overly dramatic or invasive, saying only that maybe, just maybe, I could spend some time with them while I recovered, helped around the house, tended the garden, anything that would make me feel useful again. And on the other end of the line, I heard first a silence, then an impatient sigh, and then that voice, my daughter's voice, so different now, saying with a naturalness that hurt me more than any illness, "Dad, the house is full, but there's room in the basement if you want." It was as if the world stopped for a second, as if the rain outside had stopped just so I could clearly hear the cruelty embedded in that sentence, said with no apparent intention of hurting, but which sent a dull, deep pain through me, because in that instant I understood that, to my daughter, I was no longer someone with a history, with a past, with sacrifices made in her name. I was just an old inconvenience, a burden that could be stored away with the tools, boxes of junk, and memories that were no longer used. And the worst part is that, even so, I thanked her, murmured, "It's okay, daughter, I understand," and hung up the phone with trembling hands, trying to hold back the tears that no longer obeyed reason. That night, I curled up in bed with a thin blanket, listening to the dripping of the ancient plumbing and wondering where I'd lost the thread of my own life, where exactly the line between love and submission had blurred, and if it was possible to love someone so much that you became invisible to them. The image of the basement had been playing in my head for days, a windowless, dark, damp, moldy, and forgotten space. And even though she might not have realized the weight of her words, for me, it was a warning. I no longer belonged in her life. And yet, the most absurd thing about it all is that, even in the face of that cruel response, I considered accepting. Because when you love someone like that, you don't measure the pain. You just wonder if, perhaps, there's still a way to be around. But the truth, and this pains me to write, is that something inside me began to break completely that night. Because it wasn't just about space. It was about value. It was about dignity. And I was beginning to realize that the man who always said yes was disappearing, and that in his place there was only a silent old man with a heart full of longing and a future buried in silence, as if he were already in the basement, even though he hadn't moved in yet. The first night in the basement was a kind of silent ritual of farewell to my own dignity, an unspoken transition, but felt with every fold of the old mattress that was handed to me folded, covered by a frayed and damp-stained sheet, which, according to my son-in-law, was still good enough. And even with the strong smell of mold permeating the air, and with the low ceiling that forced me to bow my head with every step, I thanked him with a forced smile and an, "Okay, thanks," as if accepting, that space were a gift. As if there still remained within me some remnant of that man who used to be called a hero by a bright-eyed girl who today didn't even come down to see if I was okay. I remember clearly how I looked around that first night, observing the rusted shelves, the boxes stacked with old junk, and the corners darkened by the damp that crept up the walls like a silent disease. And there, in that heavy, cold silence, I realized that it wasn't just a physical space where I had been placed, but rather a symbolic place, the basement of a house I helped buy, the back of a structure that excluded me even in its concrete, and I lay down on that mattress with my back aching, and my chest even more so, unable to fall asleep, listening upstairs to the hurried footsteps of Elisa and her husband, the muffled sound of a television on, and the distant crack of glasses being raised, while I, alone, stared at the ceiling and wondered how I had gotten there without realizing. The following days were dark, literally, because there were no windows in the basement, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cord flickered frequently, as if it too refused to give me constant light, and I spent the hours shrouded in shadows, unsure whether it was day or night outside, trying to fill the time with old readings or scribbling in a worn notebook, while the only company were the noises from the house above, the hurried footsteps, the muffled laughter, and the recurring sound of doors slamming shut, as if each one were a barrier between me and the rest of the world, and the absence of conversations, of glances, of simple kindnesses, began to eat away at me from the inside, as if the loneliness in that basement had teeth. What hurt most, however, wasn't the humidity or the constant cold, but rather the subtle humiliations, those that came in the form of silence, of omissions, of small gestures that said everything without saying anything. Like when I went upstairs to shower in the utility room bathroom and realized the toiletries had been hidden, or when, sitting at the table at a rare family dinner, Elisa would hand me a plate already prepared, without asking if I wanted salt, without even looking me in the eye. And my son-in-law, who never called me sir or father, would refer to me as he, as if I were an uncomfortable presence, a figure tolerated out of obligation but not truly wanted there. And I would return to the basement silent, holding back tears, because I learned from a young age that men don't cry, even if everything inside them is in ruins. Shame became a second skin, something I put on when I woke up and carried with me all day, especially when I heard Elisa talking to friends or neighbors on the phone, saying in a slightly embarrassed voice, "Oh yes, my father is living with us. But he prefers the basement, you know? It's quieter for him." And I listened to it from downstairs, my fists clenched and my heart pounding, knowing it wasn't true, that I didn't prefer any of it, that never, not even in my worst nightmares, had I imagined that one day I would be reduced to storage space in my own daughter's house. And yet, even knowing it was a lie, I didn't go up to challenge it, because shame immobilized me. because the idea of confronting it hurt more than the pain of being forgotten. On my birthday, I woke up early as usual, sat on the mattress, and stayed there for hours, waiting for a sign, a gesture, some kind of reminder, maybe a different cup of coffee, a longer good morning, or maybe even a cake, one of those simple bakery ones with sprinkles on top. But the entire day passed and no one came down, no one spoke to me, and when the sun set and the light from the house began to leak through the cracks in the ceiling above me, I understood that they had forgotten, or, worse, that they remembered and chose to do nothing. And in that moment, I felt a sadness so deep that it seemed to have a physical weight, as if a huge hand squeezing my chest and saying, "You don't matter anymore." It was that same day that, on impulse, I decided to rummage through my old document folder, the one I'd always carried with me since I left my old house, and among yellowed receipts, old certificates, and saved letters from Anna, I found the purchase contract for the property where we were staying. And as I reread those lines with the name Jorge M. Fernandez still clear and indisputable at the top of the deed, a shiver ran down my spine, because there was material proof of something my daughter seemed to have forgotten. That house, the one where I was now an unwanted guest in the basement, was still, legally, in my name. I stared at that paper for long minutes in silence with a mixture of anger, relief, and disbelief, because the truth is that for so long I had set aside my rights in the name of affection, in the name of peace, in the name of a promise I made to Anna to care for our daughter until the end. But now, with that contract in hand, something began to change inside me. A seed of lucidity began to sprout amidst the pain, and for the first time in a long time, I wondered if there was still time to recover what little of myself was left, to reverse the story that seemed already written, to leave that basement not only physically, but also symbolically, rescuing the voice I had buried along with my pride. But I still didn't know what to do. All I knew was that night, I slept with that contract under my pillow, as if it were the only shield I had left against oblivion. There were many nights when, after the house fell silent, I would turn on the dim basement light and open the notebook hidden beneath the old boxes. That same notebook with the blue cover, grimy with time, that I had kept since the days when I still dreamed of writing letters to Anna, still alive. And there, between pages stained with scribbles and misaligned words, I began, without realizing it, to record the sorrows that I had previously swallowed in silence, each sentence carrying the weight of a day lived in the shadows, each word functioning as a stifled scream that, even without an echo, needed to exist somehow, because it was the only way I found to not disappear completely, to keep alive the flame of an identity that was fading with every avoided glance, every indifferent gesture, every solitary meal in that space without natural light, where even the clocks seemed to slow down. In that notebook, I wrote everything. The small daily humiliations, the moments of physical pain, the repetitive dreams about Anna, the fear of dying in there without anyone noticing. But, as the days went by, something changed in the tone of the words, which before were just laments and began to organize themselves into clearer thoughts, into sharper reflections, almost as if that notebook were revealing a plan to me, or at least an outline of a reaction, a beginning of a response to the internal scream that echoed louder and louder within me, that scream that said, "Enough." It was there, among the handwritten pages, that I began to truly talk to myself, as I had never done before. And these conversations, more sincere than any dialogue I'd had in recent years, gradually led me to the old mirror in the basement, the one taped to the wall, cracked in the corner, where I began to stare at my own reflection in the silences, looking at that aged, scarred, opaque face, and asking myself with a pain difficult to translate, who am I now? And the answer came not with words, but with the weight of the gaze, with the curve of the shoulders, with the dry skin and the eyes that avoided their own reflections, as if I feared seeing not only the marks of time, but above all, the lack of identity that sets in when someone spends too much time being merely the foundation of another person's life. And it was on a gray morning, while I was still sorting through the contract papers and deciding whether I had the courage to use them, that a face from the past appeared at the basement door, announcing himself with a, "Hey, Jorge, is that really you in there?" That made me doubt my own ears. It was Alvaro, my old friend from my youth, with whom I played soccer in the 70s and shared confidences that life took away as quickly as it took our hair. He had come to visit his daughter who lived nearby, and by chance overheard someone on the street saying that Dona Elisa's father lived in a basement. And that moved him. He made a point of coming to see for himself if it was true, and upon finding me there, hunched over with my hands dirty with ink and papers scattered around, his face closed in an expression of contained pain, followed by a long hug, the kind that reminds us that we are still people. We talked for hours, and for the first time in a long time, I was called by name, looked in the eyes, listened to attentively. And as I told him what was happening, even though I tried to soften the details, I saw indignation grow on his face. He ended the conversation with, "You need to do something, Jorge. This is not life. This is disrespectful." And those words, coming from someone who knew my story, who knew how much I'd always been one to give in, to keep quiet, to give everything without asking for anything, served as the final spark I needed to transform the reflections in the notebook into concrete action, into a real decision. That same night, without telling anyone, I went up to the house's old office, which had been untouched for months, and sat down at the desk with the contract in hand, the updated title deed, the receipts from the sale of my old house. Everything there, everything legally indisputable. And for the first time in years, I felt more than a burden, more than a shadow. I felt once again the owner of the truth, the man who built everything with effort, who gave up his own house so that his daughter could have a comfortable life, and that no matter how much he had been pushed underground, he was still in control of the foundation of everything. The next day, I asked to speak with Elisa. She hesitated, of course, but came down in a hurry, cell phone in hand, impatiently asking what I needed. With the contract open on the makeshift table, I took a deep breath and said in the strongest voice I could muster, "Daughter, you forgot who's on the contract for this house." And the silence that followed was louder than any shout, more powerful than any argument, because in that moment she realized I knew, that I remembered, that I still had a voice, and I saw in her eyes something between surprise, fear, and discomfort, as if that man hunched over in the basement had suddenly regained his composure. What followed was a whirlwind. Nervous phone calls, harsh conversations with my son-in-law, attempts to turn the tables with emotional arguments and manipulated memories. But I remained silent, serene, with the documents in hand, ready to protect, not her anymore, but myself. And when I finally sat down with a lawyer recommended by Alvaro and presented everything, I heard from him the confirmation that, at the same time, freed and wounded me. You have every right to take back the property or, at the very least, demand that you be respected as a co-owner. There was no shouting, no fuss. There was only silence. A dense, heavy silence that fell over the house like a windless storm. And in the midst of this silence, Elisa wept. But not for me, I know. She wept because she understood that the era of submission was over, that the father who had always said yes was now saying enough, that the basement was no longer a hiding place, but the starting point of a turning point she never imagined. And so, with an envelope of documents in my hand and tears on my face, not hers, but mine, not of pain, but of confused relief, I climbed the stairs not just to leave a physical space, but to reclaim a place that, by right and by history, has always been mine. Justice, when it finally came as it does for those who are no longer in a hurry. Slow, bureaucratic, cold, but undeniably firm, with its formal language and irrefutable clauses, establishing point by point what was rightful, what had been neglected, what needed to be restored. And even though the judge's words, read in a monotonous and impersonal voice in court, carried no trace of the pain I had experienced, they represented, for me, a kind of concrete liberation, an invisible seal, placed upon my existence that said, in other words, you are not crazy, you are not exaggerating, you are not dreaming. What they did to you was wrong. And even though this justice did not heal the holes in my soul, nor erase the cold stares, nor the days of silence in the basement, it returned to me something I had buried along with my hope, the certainty that my voice still counted for something. When I returned to the house, this time not as a guest, nor as a burden, nor as a shadow, but as its rightful owner with signed papers, registered agreements, and a court order establishing my right to occupy, reconfigure, and live fully in that space, I found a strange environment, as if the walls had heard everything that had happened and now carried in every corner a silent tension. But even so, with patience and calloused hands, I began to change each room little by little, removing memories that hurt and leaving those that still gave me some comfort, like the curtain Anna sewed and that stood firm in the back room, or the bookshelf Elisa used as a child, where I still found, among yellowed pages, drawings she'd made when she was 5, with my face scribbled next to an enormous sun. And in every corner I tidied, in every piece of furniture I rearranged, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness, like someone returning home after a forced exile, only to find everything slightly out of place, as if time had passed and left them alone. The shells of things. Elisa didn't stay. After the final conversation, after the terms were made official, after realizing she could no longer sustain the dynamic of silence and control, she packed some bags, not all of them, and left without saying exactly where, leaving a short, almost cold note in hurried handwriting. Dad, I think it's best this way. I hope you're okay. And with that, without shouting, without arguing, without a real goodbye, she was gone, carrying with her the emptiness she'd left in me long before the move. And I confess that for days I walked around the house listening to echoes that weren't there, waiting to hear footsteps that never came, until I understood that the greatest noise she could leave was precisely this silence, this void where before there had been expectation, affection, promises. The neighborhood, as is customary in small places, didn't take long to react because houses talk, walls murmur, and even though I said nothing, whispers began to circulate like wind through open windows. They spoke of the daughter who abandoned her father in the basement, of the old man who recovered what was his, of the story that everyone knew in fragments, but which they completed with speculation and judgments, some looking at me with pity, others with renewed respect, and many simply with barely concealed curiosity. And I, who never liked fanfare, passed among them with a discreet wave, learning to live with this new identity of a man who had been reborn from the depths of his own house, who had reappeared in the eyes of others just when he had thought himself invisible. It was during a particularly quiet afternoon, as I finally organized the room that should have been mine from the start, that I found, inside a box of old documents, a draft of a letter I'd begun writing to Elisa months earlier, during those first weeks in the basement, a letter I'd never finished, perhaps because I knew it would never be read, perhaps because deep down, I feared saying everything that was bottled up inside me, and as I reread those shaky lines, where I said I didn't blame her, that I just wanted to be seen, that I missed the daughter who once held my hand as I crossed the street, I realized how much of my pain was made of choked words, of accepted silences, of forgiveness given before the request was even made, and I put the letter away again, not out of cowardice, but by choice, because I understood that there are things that don't need to be said to be felt, and that some hurts, no matter how deep, don't need to be avenged, but rather understood. Today, when I walk through the renovated rooms of the house, when I water the plants in the garden that was abandoned, when I make my own coffee and sit on the porch with the newspaper in my hands, I think that freedom has a strange taste. It's neither sweet nor bitter, but a mixture of both, tempered by time, by the tears that dried on their own, and by the scars that remain visible even after the wound heals, and despite everything, despite the pain, the loneliness, the breaking of bonds that I thought were indestructible, I say with the serenity of someone who has hit rock bottom, I would still say yes. Yes to loving my daughter. Yes to helping her. Yes to being there when she needed me. But now, after all, I've also learned to say yes to myself. Yes to my space, my history, my dignity. Because in the end, it's not about denying the love that was given. But remember, firmly and calmly, that no love needs to be repaid with humiliation.